Thomas Thorne gave water to a huge Apache girl, and the following day, 300 warriors encircled his ranch. This single act of common human mercy, a gesture of survival shared under the punishing Arizona sun, was the pivot upon which his entire lonely life turned. It was the trauma central to a man who thought he had outrun all consequence. The Dust Creek settlement was little more than a sun-blistered name on a forgotten government paper, a name attached to a few fenced acres and a wooden cabin near the Painted Canyon. Thomas had built it with his own hands, carving a small, defiant piece out of the vast, unforgiving frontier of 1878. He was a man of the East who had traded civilization's suffocating expectations for the brutal, honest solitude of the desert, where a man's worth was measured by the depth of his well and the straightness of his aim. His day-to-day was a rhythmic ritual of toil, the squeak of the well wheel, the smell of dry dust on his worn boots, the distant, silent promise of the canyon's edge. He valued the silence, the hard-won independence, and the water, a resource more precious than gold in this arid, copper-tinged world. But the silence was broken. One scorching afternoon, the heat shimmer revealed a collapse of movement. There, near his well trough, lay a woman. She was Apache, and taller than any woman Thomas had ever known, her features sharp and her dark eyes holding a raw, untamed suspicion that matched the landscape. Her deerskin clothes were caked with the white dust of a terrible journey, and her lips were cracked, a silent, desperate plea. For a moment, Thomas saw not an enemy of his race, but a human being brought to the precipice of death. He knelt, scooping cool water with a metal ladle. He offered it without a single word, without demanding a name or a reason. The exchange was primal, a giver of life, a receiver of survival. Her deep, unblinking eyes studied him with an unnerving clarity, a silent, profound measurement of his soul, before she drank the life-saving fluid. Then she rose with a sudden, impossible strength and vanished into the canyon's merciless heat, leaving Thomas to think the brief, strange moment of contact was over. He was catastrophically wrong. Thomas had always known that the land held a secret about him, one he kept locked away behind the high peaks of his own solitude. The man the East knew had been a promising lawyer, poised for a life of comfort. The man who lived here was a voluntary outcast, a fact he now guarded as fiercely as his water well. But the land, the spirits, or perhaps just the sheer, terrifying scale of the West, had a way of bringing all secrets to light. The truth was, the East's expectations hadn't just been suffocating. They had forced him into a deep, moral compromise that he fled across the continent to bury. The man who gave the water was not a hero, but a man seeking redemption in the desolate landscape, a fact the silent woman's eyes had seemed to somehow penetrate. The first, sickly light of the new day did not bring peace. It brought a horrifying, calculated presence. As Thomas stood outside his cabin, coffee cooling in his hand, he felt the oppressive weight of 100 unseen eyes. He looked up. Every ridgeline, every slope overlooking his ranch, the lonely Dust Creek settlement, was lined with the dark silhouettes of mounted Apache warriors. Their spears caught the rising sun, glinting like 1,000 accusations. 300 silent men, a formidable, organized siege. This was not a raid. There was no charge, no war cry. It was a declaration of overwhelming force, a simple, terrifying statement of fact. Thomas's heart did not race. It sank with a cold certainty. He stood his ground, his rifle leaning uselessly against the porch rail, his hands open and visible. He knew, with the clarity of a man facing the absolute end, that the decision had been made for him. All that remained was the verdict. From the northern ridge, a single figure began a slow, deliberate descent, riding a horse the color of midnight. The man's face was a map of time and command, his presence a weight Thomas felt in his bones. This was Chief Whispering Wind. The world Thomas had known, a world of quiet solitude and simple toil, was gone. The price of one ladle of water was about to be paid, and it would be paid not with gold, but with his destiny. The silence was a palpable, crushing weight, pressing the air from Thomas's lungs. Chief Whispering Wind stopped his horse 50 feet from the porch, his eyes, dark and ancient, boring into the rancher. The sheer number of silent men surrounding the valley transformed the ranch from a haven into a cage. The sun rose higher, making the dust motes dance in the air, illuminating the tension of the scene. Thomas could hear the rhythmic, heavy breathing of the chief's horse and the faint, persistent buzz of flies, the only sounds in a world held captive by military precision. He stood facing the power of the desert, knowing that any perceived movement of fear or aggression would be his last. Then, a second rider detached from the ranks. It was the woman from the day before, her face now scrubbed of its desperate fatigue, revealing sharp, intelligent features and an unwavering gaze. She was clad in different deerskin, indicating her status was far above that of a simple traveler. This was Red Clay. Her presence was the true call to action, the realization that his simple choice had entangled him in something monumental. The moment she spoke, her voice halting but clear, a new reality solidified around Thomas. She explained the event, translating her father's silent command. Red Clay had been on a sacred and solitary trial, the rite of the mountain, a journey of pure survival that was a test of character and ancestral devotion. The law of the trial was that no one was to intervene. When she collapsed, near death from dehydration, Thomas's water had violated the ritual, but saved the chief's blood. The emotional weight of the situation was immense, the clash between ancient law and raw human instinct. The chief's judgment was relayed with the gravitas of stone tablets. Thomas's act was not one of seeking reward, but of pure, simple necessity. This distinction, the chief's respect for the purity of the motive, was what earned him life. Red Clay translated the verdict, a terrifying new reality. Thomas was now under a prolonged, rigorous test. The warriors would not leave. They would watch his every movement for 6 days, judging whether he would betray their location to the nearest white settlement or remain a man of true, silent honor. Thomas, the master of his own land, was now a prisoner on it. His freedom, his very existence, depended on a 6-day performance of absolute loyalty to the people holding a knife to his throat. The air grew heavy with the smell of dry sage and fear. Thomas's initial shock gave way to a cold, steady determination. He saw the flicker of something deeper in Red Clay's eyes as she spoke of the rite. A hint of shame, perhaps, at the failure of her solo journey, and a complex gratitude for the rancher who saved her. The true burden he carried was the moral weight of the decision. To ride out meant betraying his unearned safety. To stay meant confronting his own race as a potential traitor. As Thomas began his forced routine under the unblinking watch of 300 men, he noticed a subtle physical detail that suggested deeper forces were in play. Near the spot where Red Clay had collapsed, partially buried in the shifting dust, he found a small, dark stone, not native to the valley, but polished and carved with a faint, spiraling symbol. It was a sign of ancient Apache travel, not simply a personal marker. The event wasn't just an accident of fate. Red Clay's journey had an objective beyond her personal test, a mission somehow connected to the hidden history of the canyons. The carved stone, discreetly slipped into his pocket, was a piece of a puzzle he didn't yet realize he was solving. For 6 days, the scrutiny was relentless, the silence broken only by the work of the rancher and the restless movement of the wind. Thomas performed his chores with stoic determination, a prisoner on his own land. His decision to accept this new, perilous path solidified in every chore. He was trading his peace for his life, his simple existence for a complex allegiance. On the morning of the 7th day, the air felt lighter, the heat less oppressive. The rancher stood, watching the sun rise, expecting the withdrawal of the silent army. But the sound that came was not the fading of hooves, but a distant, muffled thudding of repeated gunshots echoing from the valley mouth. It was a sound that announced the coming of the white world. The siege had ended, but the true test, the test of race and loyalty, was only just beginning. Red Clay appeared from the shadowed rock face behind the well, her face grim, her hands tightening on the grip of her rifle. The Apache were melting back into the hills, unseen, leaving Thomas alone in the valley as the angry, dust-covered militia thundered closer. He had crossed a threshold, accepted his fate at the hands of one tribe, only to have his entire past rush forward to demand a choice. The relentless drumming of hooves grew louder, echoing the frantic pace of the approaching danger. Thomas stood his ground, the cool metal of his well ladle still in his hand, a strange shield against the storm of the white world. The sight of Red Clay melting away, her expression a mix of urgency and warning, was the only confirmation he needed. His time of passive observation was over. The Apache had vanished, leaving Thomas alone to face the vengeful tide of his own people. Leading the charge was Jedediah Stone, a grizzled volunteer militia leader from Fort Defiance, his face a roadmap of hardship and unrelenting fury. He rode alongside a posse of heavy-armed settlers, their faces set in grim lines, their rifles held with a terrible readiness. They were tracking a ghost, a supposed raiding party whose presence had cost them dearly. When the militia finally reined in, creating a dust cloud that smelled of sweat and gun oil, their eyes locked onto Thomas. The Dust Creek settlement was no longer an isolated ranch. It was the nexus of the conflict. Jedediah Stone dismounted, the squeak of his worn leather boots scraping against the gravel. His voice was a rasping demand, cutting through the strained silence. He wanted to know the warriors' whereabouts, his eyes darting from the surrounding canyons to Thomas's stoic face, searching for a sign of complicity. For Thomas, the choice was instantaneous and impossible. To reveal the Apache location would be to betray the fragile truce, guaranteeing a bloodbath that would consume his valley and end the lives of the people who, hours before, had been his silent, terrifying captors. To lie was to risk the wrath of his own race, marking himself a traitor in their eyes. Thomas met Jedediah's gaze, his voice level, betraying none of the internal turmoil. He pointed his hand toward a false, more distant trail, toward the rugged, deceptive peaks of the distant mesas. He spoke of the vastness of the land, the deception of the canyon shadows, and hinted at the overwhelming number of warriors, 300, unseen, yet undeniably present. His refusal to panic, the sheer conviction of his calm demeanor, coupled with the implied threat of that massive invisible force, planted a chilling seed of doubt in the vengeful men. The settlers, weary and apprehensive, could not face an invisible army that had already melted away into the rock. They retreated, thunder of hooves fading, defeated not by a gun, but by the moral fortitude of one man. As the sound of their retreat vanished, the silence returned, heavier and more profound than before. Red Clay reappeared almost instantly, standing exactly where Jedediah Stone had stood. Her eyes were no longer suspicious, but held a burning, complicated respect. She confronted him. He risked everything for them, for a peace that might have been a complete lie. The moment of his choice had validated his worth beyond any ritual or spoken vow. Satisfied with his silent allegiance, Chief Whispering Wind descended again, standing before Thomas and extending a single sacred gift, a necklace of smooth blue and white beads. Red Clay translated the chief's words, explaining the brutal duality of the gift. The mark meant guaranteed peace and protection from the Apache, a bond of honor solidified. But, the chief warned, wearing that mark branded Thomas a sympathizer, a traitor in the eyes of the white world, a man who had chosen honor over tribal loyalty. The unspoken weight of the decision settled on Thomas. He had chosen his side, an allegiance of the heart, bought with his standing among his own kind. He now stood alone, eternally marked. The chief looked at Thomas, the beadwork a heavy presence in the rancher's hand. He spoke with the quiet finality of destiny, a condition laid bare by the landscape itself. Red Clay translated the final, weighty statement. The path Thomas had chosen was perilous. The peace was granted, but not easily kept. Thomas needed to prove that his honor was constant, a steady light in the chaos. The chief concluded with the weight of absolute law. Thomas could remain in the valley, protected by their watch, but in return, he would have to use his knowledge of the white world to keep the canyon paths clear of the militia, or the peace would vanish with the morning mist. The bead necklace, warm and heavy in Thomas's hand, was not merely an ornament. It was an oath, a permanent severance from his past. The silence that returned was no longer the empty isolation he had known, but a watchful, protective quiet. He was now a bridge between two hostile worlds, anchored to his valley by a perilous promise. His first trial began immediately, proving he was an asset, not merely a recipient of mercy. The challenge was subtle: to demonstrate his value in navigating the dangers posed by the white settlers without resorting to violence. His first task came not from the chief, but from Red Clay. She appeared near his well, observing his daily routine, her focus intense. The militia had left signs, subtle tracks left by their horses that only a seasoned eye could read, signs of hesitation, of potential return. Red Clay tasked him with monitoring the edges of the canyon, using his understanding of settler tactics. He began to trace the almost invisible signs of their passage, not just reading the direction of the tracks, but interpreting the mood of the riders, the weariness in the drag of a horse's hoof, the anger in the way a cigarette was ground into the dirt. Thomas applied the meticulous, almost obsessive attention to detail that had made him a sharp lawyer in the East to the complex language of the West. He was transforming from an isolated rancher into a silent sentinel. He realized the settlers' movements were not random. They followed the sparse water sources and the established trails of the gold prospectors, routes the Apache, who followed ancestral hunting grounds, rarely used. He used his knowledge of the government maps and official paper trails to predict the militia's next logical point of entry into the territory. He returned to Red Clay, not with warnings of an immediate attack, but with a complex map drawn in the dirt, a sketch detailing the old prospector trails and the known watering holes they would need to resupply at. He explained that a direct warning would be ignored, but if the Apache were to subtly block the water sources along those white trails, not by violence, but by diverting the stream or allowing livestock to muddy the water, the militia would be forced to retreat without even knowing they were close to their target. The maneuver was purely strategic, a victory of wit over weapons. Red Clay's expression shifted, a flicker of professional respect replacing her habitual suspicion. She watched him, assessing the unexpected depth of his insight. His mundane skill, the ability to read maps and predict human behavior based on logistics, a common trait in the civilized East, was the unexpected key to solving a complex problem of frontier survival. It was a strength born not of the rifle, but of the mind. Thomas, the self-proclaimed failed lawyer, was now using his unwanted past to protect his perilous present. The subtle victory earned him not praise, but a growing curiosity from the Apache watchers. A few days later, a new obstacle appeared, one that shattered his small sense of accomplishment. A rival arrived, not from the white world, but from within the Apache community. Blackfeather was a young, powerful warrior, fiercely loyal to the old ways, who viewed Thomas's presence and the chief's favor with unmasked hostility. He represented the faction that believed honor could only be bought with blood, not with the clever, quiet tactics of the white man. The challenge came publicly. Blackfeather rode down from the ridge, stopping just outside the boundary Thomas had set for himself. He spoke in a strong, clear Apache, which Red Clay had to translate, her voice tense. Blackfeather questioned the chief's wisdom, pointing to Thomas's soft hands and the lack of a warrior's scar. He challenged the rancher to prove the value of his methods in a way the warrior could understand, a test of endurance and cunning in the unforgiving canyon maze. Blackfeather demanded Thomas lead them through a hidden, treacherous path, a route used only by the most desperate smugglers, and if the white man failed to guide them safely, he would be cast out of the protection of the canyon forever. Thomas looked into the warrior's unforgiving eyes. His progress was brutally interrupted, everything he had earned now hanging on a single, silent journey into the treacherous unknown. The challenge was simple: prove his value, or be abandoned to the vengeance of the West. The air in the valley grew thick with anticipation. Blackfeather's challenge was not just a personal slight. It was a crisis of leadership, a test of the chief's faith in the rancher's unconventional value. Thomas accepted the challenge with a curt nod, his attention already focused on the treacherous, sun-baked landscape. The test was simple: safely navigate the Black Serpent Pass, a ravine known for flash floods, rockfalls, and a dizzying network of hidden traps left by smugglers and desperate men. This was not a test of strength, but of absolute focus and unwavering trust. Thomas led a small party, including Blackfeather and Red Clay, into the gorge. The crisis escalated almost immediately. Not a natural disaster, but a man-made one. As they navigated a narrow, shadowed bend, they stumbled upon an ancient, concealed tripwire. It wasn't a trap meant for men, but for water. The wire was rigged to an unstable rock face, designed to create a localized rockfall, diverting the meager flow of a vital seasonal stream. A stream that led directly to a hidden Apache water cache essential for the women and children sheltering further in the mountains. The traditional methods, speed, brute force, and observation, failed to reveal the complexity of the sabotage, which was designed with a sickening modern efficiency. Thomas immediately understood the engineering of the disaster. This was not the work of simple prospectors. It was the calculated sabotage of men who understood surveying and logistics, men like the ones he had once stood beside in the East. As Red Clay and Blackfeather debated the possibility of a direct threat, Thomas moved, tracing the fine, almost invisible wire back to its source. A small, concealed leather bag filled with a slow-burning powder, timed to detonate the rock face at dusk, ensuring the diversion of the water supply. While frantically disarming the crude device, Thomas noticed a detail that made his blood run cold. Etched into the leather casing of the powder bag was a faint, familiar symbol. A stylized compass rose with a broken needle. It was the unofficial, secretive mark of Jedediah Stone's militia, the very same men he had successfully misled days before. The realization struck him with the force of a blow. The crisis was manufactured. The militia had returned and, instead of a direct confrontation, had chosen to attack the Apache at their most vulnerable point, survival itself. The conflict was not about territory, it was about starvation. He worked with desperate speed, his lawyer's hands now deft with wire and leather, disarming the device mere minutes before its intended ignition. He had used his unwanted knowledge of the white world's malice to face a crisis that traditional Apache skill could not have anticipated. The rockfall was averted, the water source secured. When they emerged from the pass, Red Clay's face was etched with shock, not just at the danger they escaped, but at the revelation of the enemy's true, calculated ruthlessness. Blackfeather, the hardened skeptic, looked at the crude bomb and then at the rancher, a flicker of something close to gratitude passing across his stern features. But the reaction was not simple respect. As they reached the relative safety of the main canyon, Red Clay spoke with a voice low and tight with fear. The chief had trusted Thomas, given him a place. But the discovery of the militia's cruel, calculated methods Thomas understood so deeply, instilled a new fear in her. She looked at the rancher, now a proven asset, and saw a man who knew the darkness of her enemy too well. The knowledge he possessed, the ability to anticipate and thwart such complex malice, made him undeniably valuable, but also deeply unsettling. Blackfeather, however, made an unexpected move. He stepped forward, not with a spear, but with a silent gesture of respect, his first honest acknowledgement of Thomas's worth. He didn't speak the words, but his action was clear. By saving their life source, Thomas had bought his place among them. The rival had become a reluctant, complex ally, creating a fragile alliance born of shared danger and mutual respect. The averted disaster brought an inevitable period of stillness. The discovery of the militia's sinister plot had, paradoxically, strengthened the bonds within the temporary camp. Thomas was no longer the outsider under silent watch. He was the sentinel, the man whose unique understanding of the enemy's tactics kept the water flowing and the canyon safe. The days that followed were marked by quiet partnership, the true texture of a fragile, shared existence. The evenings were the calmest, centered around a small fire deep within a sheltered cave where only the most trusted gathered. The air would carry the smell of burnt juniper and the subtle aroma of healing herbs. Red Clay and Thomas often shared the watch, sitting in silence, their relationship shifting from one of suspicion and necessity to one of profound, unspoken trust. Red Clay began to share stories, not of conflict, but of the mountain's history, of the ancestral connection to the very rocks and water they were now defending. In turn, Thomas spoke, hesitantly, not of the failure he fled, but of the longing for purpose he had carried west, a purpose he had unexpectedly found in the defense of a people not his own. The connection deepened through small, shared gestures. Thomas showing Red Clay how to properly maintain a steel trap, a tool of the white world adapted for survival. Red Clay teaching him the subtle, almost musical language of the night wind through the gorges, a sound that carried far more warning than any bell. Their proximity was charged with a gentle, growing awareness. It was a bond, built not on convenience, but on the profound relief of finding a mirror for one's own silent intensity in another soul. One quiet night, as they sat mending a worn horse blanket, its coarse, rough texture a comforting presence, Red Clay pointed to the blue and white bead necklace Thomas now wore constantly. She described the pattern, explaining its ancient significance, a weaving of two distinct river stones, one from the high mountain springs, one from the desert floor, meant to flow together. This was the moment of revelation. The story of the beads, she explained, spoke of a prophecy, a time when the white man of the East, carrying a burden of silence, would meet the daughter of the wind near the place where the two great rivers, the ancestral Apache lands and the new borders, intersected. This prophecy was not about a king or a conqueror, but about an individual who would use knowledge over violence to achieve an impossible truce. The chief had recognized Thomas's inner moral struggle, his silent commitment to justice, and his self-imposed isolation. He hadn't just given Thomas a protective talisman. He had identified him as the subject of an ancient, intertribal prophecy. Their destinies were not simply intertwined by a ladle of water, but had been predestined by the confluence of their ancestors and the very land he sought to escape to. Thomas realized his flight west had been in a strange, terrible way, a pilgrimage. The newfound peace felt solid, earned, and utterly profound. Thomas touched the warm beadwork, feeling the weight of prophecy and belonging. He looked at Red Clay, the feeling of predestination creating a sense of terrifying rightness. But the vast, unforgiving West never allows contentment to linger. The fragile calm was shattered not by a scream or a shot, but by the frantic, breathless arrival of a messenger. A young Apache runner, his face drawn with exhaustion and fear, stumbled into the cave opening. He did not speak to the chief. He spoke directly to Red Clay and Thomas, his eyes wide. The message was concise and devastating. Jedediah Stone's forces had not retreated. They had regrouped and were now moving with a deadly strategic focus. They were not aiming for the main camp. They were advancing on the hidden burial ground, a site of profound sacred importance and spiritual vulnerability. The militia knew the location, a terrifying sign of an internal leak, and their objective was clear. Desecration, a strike meant to shatter the Apache spirit, not just their bodies. The peace was over, and the sacred ground was in imminent, undeniable peril. The messenger's words acted like a terrible frost, turning the comforting warmth of the fire to ashes. The focus shifted instantly from the quiet defense of life to the fierce, primal defense of spirit and memory. Thomas was no longer defending a water source or his own life. He was defending the very soul of the people who had claimed him. He was no longer a stranger. He was a fierce defender, driven by a protective fear for the vulnerable new bonds he had forged. The chief and Red Clay immediately began coordinating the defense. Thomas, however, knew that the burial grounds were too exposed and that a conventional fight would lead to unacceptable casualties. The militia's target, The sacred Valley of Whispers was a place of deep spiritual significance, but geographically it was a trap. The militia was using the emotional weight of the site to lure the Apache into open conflict. The main force of opposition, Jedediah Stone and a smaller, more focused group of about 20 determined men, had returned. But their method was far more sinister than before. Thomas, examining the hasty map drawn by the messenger, realized the militia was moving with the precise knowledge of someone who had lived among the Apache, someone who knew the land not just as a hunter, but as a resident. The plot twist came with the brutal clarity of a lightning strike. The militia was using two paths, not one. While Stone's main force advanced on the burial grounds to draw the Apache warriors, a second, smaller force was moving to secure the valley's narrow, high-altitude exit, the only escape route for the non-combatants. The knowledge of that high path was almost impossible for an outsider to possess. Thomas's legal mind, trained in identifying the inconsistencies in testimony, pieced together the impossible truth. He remembered a face he had dismissed as a background figure in Jedediah Stone's posse, a man with a distinctive, faded Apache tattoo on his wrist, a man who had lingered at the edges of their earlier confrontation. This man, Silent Runner, was a half-blood outcast, exiled years ago for breaking a sacred vow. He was the internal leak, the unexpected accomplice feeding the enemy the vital intelligence they needed to strike at the Apache heart. The threat was not just external, it was a wound from the past, made complex by betrayal. Thomas approached Red Clay, his voice low and strategic. He argued that the burial grounds were a decoy. The real threat was the silent closing of the escape route. The new plan was born of his realization. They must split their forces and intercept the smaller, more dangerous ambush team first. The decision was agonizing, a choice between defending the sacred dead and saving the living. With a determination that surprised even Red Clay, Thomas made his choice of sacrifice. The only way to stop the smaller, faster ambush team in time was to create a massive diversion at the main canyon entrance, a deception so convincing it would draw Jedediah Stone's entire attention away from the escape route, granting the women and children precious hours to flee. He knew his presence was the biggest lure Stone could imagine. Thomas took the lead, riding his horse toward the entrance of the canyon, making himself fully visible, his blue and white beadwork glinting in the harsh light. He was giving them what they wanted, the sympathizer and the knowledge he possessed. He looked at Red Clay, his eyes conveying a final, unwavering promise. He spoke the necessary fatal words to the chief. The warriors must use the diversion to secure the escape route, and he would hold Stone's attention for as long as he could. Thomas Thorne was riding toward certain danger, offering himself as the bait to save his new family, placing himself in mortal peril in the heart of the enemy's advance. Thomas rode into the open, sun-blasted mouth of the canyon, the bead necklace heavy against his skin, a target visible for miles. He was utterly alone, facing the wrath of men who saw him as the ultimate betrayal of their race. The sound of Jedediah Stone's men was not a thunder, but a calculated, steady advance. When Stone saw Thomas, standing firm on his horse in the center of the dusty trail, his face contorted in a mask of pure, vindictive triumph. Stone and his group halted, surrounding Thomas in a tight, menacing semicircle. The air crackled with a tension that was almost suffocating, thick with the smell of gunpowder and vengeful sweat. Stone did not draw his weapon immediately. He wanted Thomas to feel the weight of his own moral failure. He shouted accusations across the space, calling the rancher a traitor and a snake, mocking the beadwork as a child's toy. Thomas did not flinch, his gaze steady and unwavering. He allowed Stone's fury to burn, using the time to survey the landscape. He knew his plan rested on a victory of moral courage and strategic intelligence, not brute force. He used his knowledge of the settlers' psychology, their deep-seated fear of the unknown, and their respect for unwavering conviction. When Stone finally demanded he surrender and reveal the Apache whereabouts, Thomas spoke, his voice clear and resonant in the canyon echo. He did not deny the beadwork. He exposed the choice he had made. He told them he was protected by the enemy because he chose a path of honesty and nonviolence over tribal loyalty and bloodshed. He spoke of the sacred water, of the pure necessity of one human helping another, and of the calculated, cowardly malice of Jedediah Stone's plan to desecrate a burial ground. Then came the unexpected twist. Just as Thomas finished his indictment of Stone's moral failure, a cry echoed from the high canyon walls. It was a single, piercing call. Immediately, 3 figures appeared on the ridge above Stone's men. They were the prospectors Thomas had warned months ago about the dangerous flash floods. Men he had helped with supplies and direction. Men who had always viewed the Apache with skepticism. Now, they were aligned with Thomas, standing ready, their own antique rifles pointed not at the canyon, but at the militia. They had come to settle an old debt of kindness, an unexpected physical manifestation of Thomas's good deeds. Stone was defeated not by a volley of fire, but by the moral weight of the unexpected opposition. He looked at Thomas, the unflinching sympathizer, then at his own men, whose resolve was clearly fractured by the arrival of the impartial white witnesses. Finally, he looked at the high ridge, where the prospectors stood. Stone saw that the fight was lost, his moral authority shattered by the quiet integrity of the man he sought to destroy. The militia leader, his face a mask of defeated hatred, turned his horse sharply and retreated, his men following in a demoralized, dusty silence. The confrontation ended not in bloodshed, but in humiliation. The main threat was vanquished, their will broken. But as the dust settled, Thomas looked toward the high-altitude escape route, sensing a lingering shadow. The danger was gone, yet a cold reality remained. He knew that Silent Runner, the exile who betrayed the sacred path, had not been with Stone's main force. The small, poisonous element of betrayal had escaped, a new question about the future left hanging in the air. The ranch was safe, but the peace remained volatile. The price of his moral victory a permanent separation from the world he once knew. Months bled into a new season, washing the bitterness of the conflict from the valley floor. The sun still beat down with its relentless intensity, but now it felt less like a threat and more like a dependable presence. Thomas Thorne had found his peace, not in the empty solitude he once craved, but in the steady, vibrant rhythm of belonging. The siege lines were gone, replaced by the quiet, occasional presence of Apache patrols, silent protectors whose watchful eyes carried respect, not suspicion. The Dust Creek settlement was no longer just Thomas's ranch, it was the crossroads of truce. Thomas and Red Clay stood together near the well, not in the tense silence of their first meeting, but in the easy, profound tranquility of partnership. They had spent the long weeks rebuilding, cultivating and planning, ensuring the valley's future. The cabin was larger now, built not just for one man but for a shared life, its new timbers carrying the fresh smell of pine and the deep scent of Red Clay's ancestral carvings. They worked side by side, their hands moving in synchronized, comfortable motion, a bond built on shared water, shared danger, and shared purpose. The focus now was on legacy. The true, final revelation came in a quiet afternoon as they examined the land. Red Clay pointed to the small, polished, spiraling stone Thomas had found near the well during the siege. She revealed that the stone was a marker, and the pattern was the symbol of the ancient waterkeepers, a lineage of individuals, both native and rare outsiders, tasked with protecting the arid valley's fragile sources. Thomas's own ancestors, the ones he had fled the disappointment of, had not been simply settlers. Generations ago, a branch of his family had been cartographers and surveyors who discreetly recorded the location of these very water tables, an act of silent preservation, not exploitation. His act of giving water had not been an accident of fate, but the fulfillment of an ancient familial obligation. His flight west was not a retreat from failure, but the destined return to a sacred duty. The silence he sought was not the absence of sound, but the quiet truth of his own destiny, the discovery that his belonging was rooted in the very land he thought he had chosen arbitrarily. The true strength, the narrator reflected, was not in the rifle or the flight, but in the choice to honor a higher law than the law of man. The family was not born of blood alone, but was forged in the fire of shared sacrifice, the acceptance of the vulnerable, and the unwavering defense of what is good. The home Thomas had found was not a place on a map, but the powerful, profound feeling of security and respect in the eyes of red clay. He touched the warm beadwork around his neck, the true cost of which was the peace of mind he could now afford to have. The legend of the white man who saved the water was already being told in the Apache camps, a tale of wisdom and courage that would bring peace to the valley for generations. The journey was over, but the great work, the simple, necessary act of living with honor, had only just begun. A true Western story is one of sacrifice and hard-won peace. If this journey of honor and redemption resonated with you, let us know in the comments below. What part of the world are you listening from? Your support helps us tell these timeless tales. Don't miss the next adventure. Make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications.